A generation ago, making $100,000 a year was considered rich. Not wealthy, not private jet rich, but rich enough that most people assumed you had made it. Nice house, reliable car, family vacations, money left over at the end of the month. That was the dream. But today, there are people making $100,000 a year who genuinely feel like they're falling behind. So what happened? Did people suddenly become bad with money? Did everyone start overspending? Or did the rules of the game quietly change? Because here's what's interesting. The more I researched this topic, the more I realized something. A lot of people aren't imagining this. In many ways, making $100,000 today doesn't feel anything like making $100,000 did a generation ago. And once you see the numbers, you'll understand exactly why. But more importantly, we're going to answer the question that really matters. If six figures doesn't feel rich anymore, how are normal people supposed to build wealth? Let's start with where this idea came from in the first place. For decades, $100,000 was viewed as a financial milestone. It was the number, the income level that told people they had finally made it. And honestly, that made a lot of sense. Back in 1990, the median household income in America was around $30,000 per year. So earning $100,000 meant you were making more than 3 times what the typical household earned. That was a big deal. At the same time, the median home price in America was about $123,000. Think about that for a second. A house cost a little more than 1 year's salary for someone earning 6 figures. Today, that same comparison looks completely different. And once we compare what happened to home prices, incomes, and the cost of living over the last few decades, you'll start to see why so many people feel financially stuck even when they're earning more money than ever before. Now, before we go any further, I want to be really clear about something. This is not one of those videos where I'm going to tell you that everything is hopeless. It's not. This is also not one of those videos where I'm going to pretend that nothing changed and all you need to do is stop buying coffee. Because that's nonsense. The reality is somewhere in the middle. Things really did get harder. But that doesn't mean building wealth became impossible. And that distinction matters. Because if you believe the game is unwinnable, you stop playing. But if you understand how the game changed, you can adapt. And that's what this entire video is about. So let's talk about what actually changed. The first thing is housing. And honestly, housing alone explains a huge part of why people feel financially squeezed. Remember that median home price of roughly $123,000 back in 1990? Today, the median home price in America is over $400,000. Let that sink in for a second. Home prices didn't just go up, they exploded. And before someone says, yeah, but incomes went up too, you're right. They did. The median household income in 1990 was around $30,000. Today, it's roughly $84,000. That's a substantial increase. But here's the problem. Home prices grew much faster than incomes. And that's before we even talk about mortgage rates. Because the monthly payment is what people actually feel. It's one thing for a house to cost more. It's another thing entirely when borrowing money to buy that house also becomes more expensive. Which means millions of Americans are facing a double hit. Higher home prices, higher borrowing costs. And that's why so many people look at housing today and feel like they're trying to hit a moving target. Every time they save a little more money, the target moves again. And housing isn't the only thing that's gotten more expensive. Think about groceries for a second. Almost everybody watching this video has had the exact same experience. You walk into the grocery store, you grab a few basics, maybe some meat, a few vegetables, a couple drinks, nothing crazy. And then somehow you get to the checkout and the total is $100 or $200. And you're standing there wondering how you just spent that much money. Now, obviously inflation isn't new. Prices have always gone up over time. That's normal. The problem is the speed. Since the year 2000, cumulative inflation in the United States has been roughly 90%. In other words, something that cost $100 back then would require roughly $190 today just to buy the same thing. And that's just the official inflation numbers. Because most people don't experience inflation as a statistic. They experience it as real life. They experience it when their car insurance jumps. They experience it when rent goes up. They experience it when property taxes increase. They experience it when healthcare gets more expensive. They experience it every time they swipe their card and wonder why everything suddenly costs more. And honestly, that's where a lot of the frustration comes from. Because people aren't necessarily expecting life to stay the same forever. What they're struggling with is the feeling that they're working harder while getting less in return. And that's a very different thing. Now, here's where this gets even more interesting. Because if you only looked at income, you might assume things are getting better. After all, wages have gone up. Many people are making more money than their parents ever did. Some people are making more money than they ever thought possible. And yet, a surprising number of Americans still feel financially stressed. Why? Because income is only half of the equation. What really matters is purchasing power. In other words, what your money can actually buy. And for many households, that purchasing power doesn't feel nearly as strong as it used to. That's why we're seeing some pretty shocking numbers. Recent surveys suggest that somewhere between 57% and 67% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Think about that. More than half the country. Not a small group. Not just people earning minimum wage. More than half. And some of those people are earning incomes that would have been considered incredibly successful a generation ago. Now, obviously, everybody's situation is different. Some people have debt. Some people have children. Some people live in high-cost cities. Some people made financial mistakes. But when more than half the country reports feeling financially squeezed, that's no longer an individual problem. That's a signal. Something bigger is happening. And that's where I think a lot of people begin to feel stuck. Because they do everything they're told to do. They work hard. They get raises. They save money. They try to be responsible. And yet somehow the finish line keeps moving further away. Then there's retirement. And this is the part that honestly surprised me the most. Because while people are struggling with today's expenses, many are also struggling to prepare for tomorrow. The median retirement savings for American families is only around $87,000. Now think about that. Most people understand that retirement could last 20 or 30 years. Healthcare costs continue to rise. Living expenses continue to rise. And yet many households have far less saved than they would like. In fact, millions of Americans have no dedicated retirement savings at all. Not because they're lazy, not because they don't care, but because when you're focused on surviving the present, it's really hard to prioritize the future. And that's where the cycle begins. The cost of living rises, savings become harder, retirement contributions get delayed, debt starts creeping in. And before long, people begin to feel like they're running on a treadmill, working harder, moving faster, but somehow staying in the exact same place. Then we get to debt. Because while incomes have increased over time, so has borrowing. Today, Americans collectively carry well over $1 trillion in credit card debt. And the average household carries thousands of dollars in revolving balances. Now, credit cards aren't inherently bad. Used responsibly, they're just a tool. But when everyday expenses start getting pushed onto credit cards, that's usually a sign that household budgets are under pressure. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Which brings us back to the original question. If making $100,000 doesn't feel rich anymore, if housing costs more, if groceries cost more, if insurance costs more, if retirement feels further away, then how are normal people supposed to build wealth? Because at this point, it would be pretty easy to become cynical. It would be easy to throw your hands in the air and say the game is rigged. It would be easy to conclude that building wealth is only possible for people who already have money. But here's the thing. The more I researched this topic, the more I realized that conclusion is wrong. Because even though the game changed, people are still becoming wealthy. Ordinary people, teachers, engineers, electricians, nurses, small business owners, people with normal jobs. So the question isn't whether building wealth is still possible. The question is, what do they understand that everyone else doesn't?
For a simple way to potentially earn some extra cash while setting up your banking? Right now, SoFi is offering new customers a chance to earn cash bonuses when opening a SoFi checking and savings account. Using the link in the description, eligible users may receive a $25 bonus for opening an account, plus an additional $50 or even up to $400 when setting up qualifying direct deposits of $1,000 or more. Bonus amounts depend on eligibility and direct deposit activity, and terms and conditions apply. If you decide to check it out using my referral link, I may also receive a referral bonus, so it helps support the channel as well. As always, do your own research, read the terms carefully, and make sure any financial product fits your own situation and goals. You can find the link down in the description below.
And that brings us to what I think is the biggest misconception in personal finance. A lot of people look at everything we just talked about: higher housing costs, higher living expenses, more debt, more financial pressure, and they come to one conclusion: I need to make more money. Now, don't get me wrong. Making more money absolutely helps. Nobody is arguing otherwise. But here's the problem. If income alone solved the issue, everyone making six figures would feel wealthy. And clearly that's not what's happening. In fact, one of the biggest lessons I've learned studying money is that there is a huge difference between income and wealth. Income is what you earn. Wealth is what you keep. And that's where the game starts to change. Because if you go back a few generations, saving money was often enough. You worked, you saved, you bought a house, you put money in the bank, and over time, life generally worked out. But today, saving money alone is becoming a lot harder. Not because saving is bad, not because emergency funds aren't important, they absolutely are, but because inflation slowly works against idle cash. Think about it this way. If inflation averages roughly 3% per year, and your money earns less than that, you're technically losing purchasing power every single year. Your dollars might still be there, but what those dollars can buy slowly shrinks. And that's why so many people feel like they're doing everything right while still struggling to get ahead. The old rules haven't completely disappeared. They just aren't enough by themselves anymore. And that's where investing comes in. Now, before some of you click away because investing sounds intimidating, hear me out, because this is where most people overcomplicate things. When people hear investing, they often picture Wall Street traders, charts, candlesticks, options contracts, people screaming on trading floors. And honestly, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about ordinary people. People with normal jobs, normal incomes, normal lives. The people who consistently build wealth over time are usually doing something surprisingly boring. They're investing regularly, they're investing automatically, and they're doing it for a very long time. That's it. Not sexy, not exciting, but incredibly effective. And the reason it works comes down to something called compound growth. Now, I know that phrase sounds fancy, but the idea is actually pretty simple. Imagine somebody invests $100 every month, not $1,000, not $5,000, just $100. That's roughly the cost of a few restaurant meals, or a couple streaming subscriptions and some impulse purchases. If that money grows at roughly the historical long-term return of the stock market, around 10% annually, something remarkable starts to happen. The first few years don't look very exciting. In fact, it almost feels disappointing. But then something interesting happens. The growth starts generating growth, and then that growth starts generating growth. And eventually the snowball begins rolling on its own. That's the power of compounding. And it's one of the reasons ordinary people continue becoming millionaires every single year. Not because they discovered some secret stock, not because they got lucky, not because they were financial geniuses, but because they consistently invested over long periods of time. In fact, one of the most fascinating discoveries from studies like The Millionaire Next Door is that many millionaires don't look wealthy at all. They're not driving Lamborghinis. They're not posting pictures from private jets. Many of them are teachers, engineers, business owners, electricians, accountants, people you'd never notice in a grocery store. They simply spent years following habits that gradually built wealth. Which brings us back to the real issue. The problem isn't that building wealth became impossible. The problem is that many people are still using a playbook designed for a different era. An era where home prices were lower. An era where pensions were more common. An era where saving money alone could do a lot more of the heavy lifting. Today's environment requires a different approach. And honestly, that sounds scarier than it actually is. Because the good news is that the new rules aren't complicated. The new rules are surprisingly simple. Spend less than you earn. Avoid high-interest debt whenever possible. Build an emergency fund. Take advantage of tax-advantaged accounts like a Roth IRA or a 401k. Invest consistently. And most importantly, give it time. Because time is still the most powerful wealth-building tool available to ordinary people. Not intelligence, not luck, not a six-figure salary. Time. And that's why I think so many people ask the wrong question. They ask, how much money do I need to become wealthy? When the better question is, what system am I following? Because a person making $70,000 with a good financial system can absolutely outperform someone making $120,000 with no plan at all. And that's something we don't talk about enough. Now, does that mean life isn't harder today? Of course not. There are real challenges that previous generations didn't face in exactly the same way. But here's what I don't want you to take away from this video. I don't want you to leave thinking the game is rigged. I don't want you to leave thinking wealth is impossible. And I definitely don't want you to leave thinking because $100,000 doesn't feel rich anymore, there's no point trying. Because that simply isn't true. The reality is much more encouraging than that. The people who build wealth over the next 10, 20, and 30 years won't necessarily be the people who make the most money. They'll be the people who understand the new rules, the people who learn how money works, the people who invest consistently, the people who stay patient when everyone else wants instant results, the people who focus on building assets instead of just increasing income, and the people who understand that wealth is usually built slowly before it ever appears suddenly. $100,000 doesn't feel the way it used to. A lot has changed. But the opportunity to build wealth, that's still here. You just have to play the game that's being played today, not the one people were playing 30 years ago. And that might be the most important financial lesson of all.